Hello and welcome everyone. Thanks for joining us for this month's State of Freight webinar. My name is Julia Becker. I'm the Vice President of Media Operations here at FreightWaves, and I'll be your host for today. As always, I'm joined by our founder and CEO, Craig Fuller, and Head of Freight Market Intelligence, Zach Strickland. Today's conversation will cover the latest insights from our Sonar platform, current market trends, and an update on the state of the industry as a whole. Craig and Zach will also be answering all of your questions live following our discussion. But before we jump in, I want to cover just a couple of quick items. First, if you have any issues during the webinar, you can reach out to our team via that audience chat function in your webinar console, and we'll be in touch to help. If you have questions for Craig and Zach, please enter those in that Q&A box also in your console. We'll save some time at the end of our discussion and go through as many questions as time allows. We'll also be sending a link to the recording of this webinar tomorrow if you'd like to view it on demand or share it with your colleagues. And now I'll go ahead and turn it over to Zach to kick off today's discussion.
All right, thank you, Julia, and thanks everybody for tuning in today or listening or however you're viewing this. Joined by Craig Fuller, as always, our CEO, and we are going to talk about the top, hottest freight market topics. And Craig, I got to ask you first, though, what is top of mind for you for the freight market right now?
So a lot is happening. We're headed into the election season. Right. We have to talk about the election as we do every time we've been together for the last couple of months because it's important. But there is something bigger that is on the agenda that could be massively disruptive. And it's not Mother Nature. It is a union contract.
Right.
The dock workers on the East Coast, their contract is up for renegotiation or renewal or cancellation, depends on which, however we decide.
Yeah.
It won't be a renewal. It will be a complete re-envision of that contract, we'll say. And that is due October 1st.
I know.
The Biden administration came out. There are a lot of questions. I think we may have mentioned it last time. I certainly have talked about it, about what would happen. Would the Biden administration step in to keep the ports running, or would they let them actually strike? And what we saw a couple of days ago is a report that the Biden administration, I think Reuters had originally reported it, that they are not going to stand in and prevent the strike. They're going to let them strike. Now, if that is true, I don't believe it was an official statement. It was a report leaked from the White House. If that's true, then we could be having a major supply chain issue headed into peak season.
Yeah, and of course, I think we need to kind of explain to some of our viewership, which may not be in the transportation cycle, why this is an important thing, because this is the Eastern Coast ports.
East Coast ports.
Yeah.
Yep. Typically, there's now Savannah's exempt from it, so Savannah's not a unionized port.
Right.
I mean, if you follow unions, they typically are the West Coast, California, the whole all up and down the Pacific Coast, and in the northeastern parts. And there are ports in the lakes, but we're not talking about those.
Right.
We're talking about international imports coming in places like Newark, where you have, in New York, you have so much volume of product moving to the East Coast. And the timing is the important thing. Like if this was going to happen in April, it can be disruptive. But we're talking about October, and a lot of those imports that are coming in October are bound for holiday stores and holiday retail and holiday e-commerce because you still have enough lead time. If you think about the timing, if it comes into a container in, say, October 10th, it's going to make the supply chain networks for the holiday season, even if it gets there by, say, early November. Now, if it's November 15th, you're literally pushing it. But really, you've got about a month where those products can clear customs, can be, the container can be broken, products sorted into distribution networks. You're pretty good. You got about a month lead time. And that would be massively disruptive to supply chains if that happened, particularly in parts of the country that are contested in terms of, Pennsylvania is definitely benefiting from that East Coast. It's part of that Allentown, PA. So a lot of those products come off from Newark into Allentown, where they're then distributed through that whole section of the country. So those consumers, if this goes on long, could see disruptions. Will that show up at the polls? You could make an argument that the administration does not want, or at least the Harris administration does, the incoming administration, if they were win the election, does not want controversy related to supply chain right before an election.
Right. So, a lot of the retail goods come in because the holiday shipping season begins earnestly around, in October for the long haul. And November is when they start to get a little bit sensitive to that demand side push from consumers. Of course, we got Prime Day now as an added component and an added layer there. But also on top of the containers for the retailers, there's also the manufacturing sector's influence, which is way more just-in-time oriented, correct?
For sure. I mean, it is, but you do have, absolutely, there is some just-in-time elements. Containers don't typically have the time sensitivity until it does.
Right.
And so normally supply chain managers will plan around, will put some lax, because anyone who's done ocean freight knows that things aren't as predictable as perhaps air freight. Air freight's fast, but it's also very predictable.
Right.
If you have a disruption in an aviation event, you're probably out a day. But if you have a disruption in containers, it could be weeks, and people know that. They plan for it. So I don't think a short-term impact in terms of manufacturing is really going to impact the supply chain if it goes on for 2 weeks.
Right.
I do think there's a risk for retail season, because a lot of those products, companies have gone out and bought them specifically to liquidate them over the holidays. And if they don't have access to those products at that time, we may see supply chain disruptions, which I don't think the Biden administration, and I should say that, potentially the Harris administration, if they were to win, I don't think the Harris camp would want supply chain issues making the news. Now, this will be spun as a pro-labor, pro-union story, and that will also likely weigh in. Is the Biden administration is arguably the most pro-labor administration in decades. And so there's a chance that they actually let them strike and let them work it out, and that becomes a legacy. Yeah. There's also these reports, which I think are interesting. I didn't mean to dive into deep politics. We're not a mainstream media business, but I do think there's an interesting storyline of reported tension between the Biden camp and the Harris camp. The Biden camp is in charge of of whether or not they force a cooling off period. I believe it's for 60 days. Harris administration, even though she's vice president, may or may not have influence of that decision, and it will be interesting to see what happens. So I think this is probably the most interesting story.
There is a political influence here that you have to acknowledge.
Political influence.
It's not that we're picking a side here. It's that we're literally saying this is what's happening and what's influencing.
And this is the silly season for politics. This is when you get the crazy promises that you have to consider as there are potential impacts if for some reason any of these policies come into effect. And so we're seeing a lot of policies floated and promises made by politicians, and both parties have made some really crazy policies.
Right.
A lot of them have actually sound pretty reasonable. And the problem is it's the crazy stuff that gets all the headlines. There are things that I'm like, that is something that we would love to see. There are other things you're like, I hope that they're not serious.
Yeah, I want to put this into a little bit further context for the audience. I want to pull up the IOTI chart here, the inbound ocean TEUs volume index. It measures, it's an index that measures 20-foot equivalent containers coming into the United States from all over the world. And the shocking thing of this chart to me, Craig, is that we are on par in the last month or so with the COVID era shipping situation. Now, it hasn't lasted for nearly as long and created the bottlenecking that we saw during COVID by any means, but we're seeing a pretty strong amount. Now, until the last couple of days, we're seeing a little bit of a trailing off here, but I think a lot of this is influenced by the ILA strike, as well as some of the ongoing Red Sea conflict.
It's interesting because you get a lot of anecdotal evidence, but the facts are always a little bit more challenging to figure out whether or not this is related to labor events or geopolitical events. I think all of that plays into it.
Right.
Like the attacks in the Middle East and the Red Sea, certainly the ILA strike.
Yeah.
I think all that matters. I think Donald Trump's tariff, floating a 60% tariff on China, also, I talked to a manufacturer that imports a lot of steel, and he said that they're buying as much steel as they can get their hands on because of the threat of strikes. I mean, think about steel. Steel is if there has been a tariff that we've loved as Americans to do trade disputes, it still is the classic example of that. And so they're actually trying to import as much steel as they can possibly get their hands on, just because they don't want to run out or have a disruption or a huge significant cost increase. But one of the things that I think is interesting, and we've talked about this I think last time we were together, is that what is also happening is that the Chinese domestic consumer has not come back from COVID. Like, COVID's over, but their spending has not come back. That the Chinese domestic consumer economy is reeling from a significant downturn with no sense of recovery. And what's happened is all that manufacturing capacity producing all of these products have to go somewhere. And who better than to buy these products on the cheap than American consumers? And so I think what's happening is a lot of these manufacturers producing a lot of product have excesses and are willing to deal and are effectively dumping a lot of these products on American consumers. Retailers are going to buy them. Like, they're going and saying, I want to do deals, I need to do deals, I need to bring some products that I can significantly discount for my consumers for the holidays. And I think that's what we're seeing is driving a lot of this. One of the interesting things that we may have talked about, I certainly have talked about it, is Prologis, world's largest industrial REIT, about 5% of global GDP runs through their warehouses. They see more freight, to put this in perspective, Zach. UPS, FedEx, DHL combined. That's how much freight runs through their warehouses. I mean, they're a real estate firm. They're not handling the freight, but they have a ton of perspective what's going on. And what they told me was, unlike this last supply chain crisis that happened in 2021, 22, is they were getting a lot of new exploration for new project builds. A lot of big companies were coming saying, we need to expand warehouses. And they said, typically when they see high volumes in ports, it drives a lot of new project expansion. Not seeing it this time. And the reason, if you look in the data, that they're not seeing it is that the majority of those products that are coming in are the same major big box retailers that have a big big supply chain networks and are driving the majority of the volumes. In other words, unlike 2021, when we saw if I was building a house and so we were waiting on product, the problem was we could be waiting on windows and we couldn't finish the floors because all this stuff was causing problems. And if you were a manufacturer, you were trying to import components to show up in your factories. That's not the issue right now. Is that it's the high volume shippers that are importing. And those high volume shippers are not dealing with manufacturing disruptions or dealing with
the upstream disruption.
The upstream stuff in terms of components, maybe an auto manufacturer and I'm waiting on a radio dial, I think was one of the examples, or tires and airbags. There's a lot of this stuff that happened during COVID that we're not seeing this time around. And that's why a supply chain crisis doesn't, from that perspective, related to volume, doesn't appear to be something is on my radar, something I'm worried about. I think what we're seeing is just a lot of volume of product. And I think we're seeing retailers that are taking advantage of lower cost imports from China and other parts of the world as the rest of the world sort of struggles economically.
I want to talk about demand specifically around trucking demand or domestic surface transportation demand. So I want to pull up the OTVI, if you will. We talked about import volume, the IOTI, which is the 20-foot equivalent units coming into the United States. It has three options once it starts coming into the United States. So we talked about the port strike and the potential disruption there. That is right at the ports. But then once it leaves the ports, it has three options. It goes into a warehouse, gets on a truck, gets on a train. Those are the primary directions that it goes. Now, we looked at IOTI, COVID level IOTI. It is not translating to the same type of situation for the OTVI, which is what you're looking at here. What are some of the reasons behind that, do you think?
It's exactly what I just said, is that the companies that are importing, those big box retailers, those companies that are moving a lot of volume, already have logistics networks. I mean, Amazon ended up leasing 30 more, or ended up turning 30 facilities back, I think, to Prologis and other real estate firms because they had overbuilt their warehouse capacity than they needed. COVID caused a lot of I wouldn't call it knee-jerk reactions, maybe you could say that, but almost like an overexpansion. And those companies, being as disciplined as they are, said, wait a second, we don't need this. And I think what's happening is that the reason we're not seeing it in the truckload volume is those companies already run a pretty sophisticated logistics network where they already have dedicated trucking, they already have their line haul services between their distribution centers, and frankly, they have some time that they can put stuff in warehouses and wait for those moments. Eventually, my theory is that eventually that volume does hit the trucking business. It just hasn't yet.
Right.
So we're seeing a lot of warehouse demand, or we're seeing a lot of volume go into warehouses and distribution centers. But one of the things about particularly bigger ticket items or stuff that turns quickly is retailers are ordering those things 6-7 months before, are actually getting them 7 months before the holiday season. They do want to turn them quickly, but they're also able to liquidate the fall clearance. Halloween is now it's funny because you never remember what holiday is coming until you walk into Walmart.
Right.
Or Walgreens. It's usually Walmart for me, where I live, Target.
Yeah.
And you walk in and you're like, oh my God, Halloween's coming up.
Yeah.
Like you don't remember until all the decorations are out.
Yeah.
You know, I always love going into the stores in early January, gift card season. We're done with the Christmas stuff. We're liquidating that. You walk in and Valentine's is taking over Walmart. And so that is it's just the way it is. And so I think right now is Halloween is happening. Halloween merch is happening. We're going to be into the Christmas season before we know it, and that's going to drive a lot of the activity. And I think we'll see an uptick in volume as we head into the fourth.
I mean, we have seen an uptick in volume around Labor Day. It just has not manifested in any kind of significant
We talked about this, and I've been on the road show this week as well. It's interesting if you sort of go back. Can we pull the chart up, RoTVI, on our program screen, Zach?
Yeah,
if you go look at the chart and look at how it's been trending, it is definitely up from where we were earlier this year.
Yeah.
But one of the things I think, and we've talked about this, is that normal seasonality, the events that drive developments in the market, and I think RoadCheck was the first time we noticed it.
Right.
For the first time in 2 years, we saw the RoadCheck week move the freight market.
Yeah.
Then we saw Memorial Day. Then we saw July 4th. We've seen Labor Day.
Yep.
And what that tells me is while it's not a great year, and it is certainly above last year, we are seeing a normalization of the market. So the question that I get asked a lot is, when is it going to recover? We've made predictions on here, and you can certainly find critiques in what we've said and find things that you disagree with. But one of the things I will point out is, what is the definition of normal? Like at the end of the day, is it, when we talk about normal, are we talking about a market that was like 2021? That wasn't normal. Are we talking like a market like 2018? That wasn't normal. Are we talking like a market like 2015? That wasn't normal. So what is normal? I look at it and say, are we seeing conditions in the market where seasonality, either high or low, but it is having an impact, an event is having an impact on the freight market. And I think we are certainly seeing that this year, where an event is driving, events do drive the conditions of the market. 2019, which I know you're going to show in a second, the burnt orange, can we pull that up real quick? Because I think that's interesting. Is when we look at 2019 being very close to 2000 and like this year, I think what's really interesting about it is just the fact that 2019 was such an abysmal year.
Yeah, for OTRI. Yeah, pull up the OTRI chart. There we go. And it's a 2019, arguably, like, you know, we talked about it a lot, like, that's when we had a lot of carrier exits. You know, the media side was discussing this almost.
It was the bloodbath.
Yeah.
It was the largest number of exits in history, simply because the market was much bigger than it was back in the great financial crisis. But on proportion, it was the second worst period in time. And that was 2019. These charts, if you look at the burnt orange and the white, they're trending similarly in terms of direction. We've seen a little bit of break in September.
We outperformed August. But year over year, I mean, the light blue.
Normal. I mean, go look at the end of the second quarter, end of the third quarter. That period looks very similar. In fact, if you stripped out one of those charts and said, guess which year, you wouldn't be able to do it.
Right. Yeah, so the white line, of course, tender rejection index measures the percentage of loads being rejected by the carrier from the shipper. So the higher the number, anything above like 7-8% tends to be a relatively tight market. Anything below about 5 to 6% tends to be a relatively loose, deflationary market. We are at a 4.5%-ish. We're hovering around that for a minute now. That is a loose environment. We've had some directional.
It is a loose environment. And I think if you wanted to critique the rebound argument that we've made, your critique would be that it's at 4.5%. It's not tight. I would argue that what is important and what everybody should keep in mind is that 2024 has been better, even today, with it sort of reverting back to a lower than 19. It is relatively better than where we were even a year ago. And we're seeing some level of normalization because of that seasonality. And I think that's an important thing that can't be lost. How long does this market last in terms of this softness? Do we go on another year of less like really abysmal conditions? It is certainly possible. I'm more bullish about next year, and I'm even bullish about the end of the fourth quarter, frankly, because imports have got to drive some of this.
Yeah, I agree with that for sure. I know I was thinking that September might be one of those early breaking moments for the market.
I did as well. I thought actually we would see better
based on what we saw in June this year, because June was actually a direct result of all the imports coming in early. We had everybody was talking in the maritime side about an early peak.
But remember, a lot of this is merch. Like it's merchandising and what is seasonally relevant. Like just like the holiday example I gave, is you have back to school. Happening, if you think about imports specifically, because produce, I mean, it does come in containers, but a lot of what you see is consumer finished goods, manufactured goods, headed for retail. In the June cycle, headed in there, and even into July 4th, what you see is a lot of back to school, the fall products that people have. You know, you've moved from shorts to pants to slacks. Got to get your stuff for back to school. And so a lot of that is driving that part of the season. This weird period from August and September where you got your fall line up, you know, a lot of candy, which is sold over Halloween, which is the majority. Costumes are probably not a huge skew.
No.
Still a lot of them, but like.
They matter.
They matter, but they're not a ton. It's the Halloween candy isn't, a lot of that stuff's not being imported anyways. And so I think what we're in this period of time where we need to move past September into October, where the holiday merch really starts to matter and show up in the data. Because I think a lot of this stuff is just sitting in warehouses waiting to explode into our freight market.
Yeah, and the sense of urgency isn't there right now for a shipper.
Why would you?
Yeah.
You don't want your store stocked with, you know, your big expensive holiday, like whatever the new holiday toy is. Is there a toy this year? I don't know. I have young kids. I should know this, right?
Yeah, you would know more than me.
It's like all video games, but I guess Lego is like the universal.
You can download those too now.
What's that?
You can download the video games now too.
You can. That's actually a lot. That's a lot we do.
So we talked about the demand side. It's actually not bad. There's a lot of warehouse freight. There's another factor here that I think we can't ignore in the way that intermodal, the rail side growth, has been relatively strong and consistent. So I want to pull up the domestic loaded and international container volume chart here, because this is additional capacity that we really weren't accounting for in some of our predictions.
100%. And what is underappreciated about rail and truck for people who are casual observers is that this is interchangeable, fungible capacity. Like the chassis are not fungible because you had to have them. The boxes are normally not fungible because TOFC is not really not much of a thing these days. Most of it's container on flat car.
On flat car,
And so a lot of the capacity like is a modality element, but it is fungible in terms of demand. And shippers will move and route freight based on the least cost when service is not a priority. Service isn't a priority. If this is truly imports for the holidays, and I contend that it is, then if I'm importing, I can easily put it on an intermodal rail car and run it from a distribution center across the country, and it show up in Fort Worth, Texas, or Joliet, Illinois, or Kansas City, or Memphis, or even Newark. Like send that thing on to Allentown, PA.
In a rail yard for a minute, it gets on the
It may
drayage
take
provider.
5 weeks to get there, all the changes. Not that long, I'm joking, but maybe it takes 2 weeks to go from LA to Pennsylvania. And by the time it gets there, you're still gonna sit there for a month. So in some ways, retailers don't have an incentive to put it into warehouses. In fact, they don't want it into warehouses. And in certain states, you have to pay taxes on inventory. So if it's in transit, don't worry about it.
Storage. These are moving storage units to a lot of shippers at this point.
They're absolutely moving storage, and there is a tax game being played because if it's in transit, you don't pay taxes in certain states.
Yeah.
I had this conversation with a friend of mine who's he's a CFO, and in a state that doesn't have inventory taxes, and he had no idea because he's never dealt with like inventory taxes. And I'm like, this is a thing, in a lot of states, you have to pay taxes on inventory. He's like, that's not real. I said, I'm telling you, when I was running a trucking operation, when I was at US Express, Compaq Computer, which is now HP, but Compaq in Houston, because Texas has an inventory tax, would actually, right before the end of the year, would call and order hundreds, if not thousands of truckloads that we would load that had no destination, that would go to a drop yard because they were in transit.
Right.
And they needed to get them out of the facility so they wouldn't have to tax them. Now, I don't know how the tax issues work in terms of intra-year or intra-month. That is well beyond, and I don't know how the states assess it. But I do know that you don't want to take up warehouse space. And if you have no incentive to put it into a warehouse and report as inventory, then you wouldn't do it. The other thing to keep in mind is a lot of retailers got slammed back in 22 for having too much inventory.
Right.
If it's in transit, it ain't in inventory.
Right.
And so there is an advantage for a lot of these retailers of not having to take possession of the product that is not necessarily in their inventory network.
Yeah, and we're not having, so one of the things that's also different from the COVID era, one, there appears to be more efficiency around the ports and the railheads at this point. There's not as much disruption there because they're not as overwhelmed. Number two, if you look at the top line there, that's the international container unit. That's the 20-foot and 40-foot equivalent unit, or 20-foot units that are coming straight from the boats. And they're not operated by the domestic side. They are literally controlled by the freight forwarders and the international carriers. They're allowing them to ship. That's a 15% year-over-year growth in international containers being allowed to move inland. That did not happen in COVID.
I think it's a great point. And it also goes back to who's paying the freight bill and who actually owns the products. And again, a lot of taxation goes into this, a lot of decisions on it, whereas you're moving freight into COVID, like you said. If you remember, the railroads are a mess.
UP shut down.
If you go back to COVID, we had the rail yards were being shut down because of COVID issues. You had the ports shut down. We had chassis all over the place. Couldn't get your hands on chassis if your life depended on it. And it was just massive chaos. And I think this is a part, the Bloomberg chief economist tweeted this a couple of weeks ago, maybe at this point, maybe a month. We may have talked about it. But she had warned about supply chain crisis because she was looking at the import volumes in a volume of supply chain, like demand at the ports, the volume of containers, and saying there could be another supply chain crisis. And I don't think that's the case. And I think it's not a case because what was causing the supply chain crisis back in 22 was the massive level of uncertainty, and everybody was ordering everything, and you had downline components, you couldn't get anything in, and everything was just massive chaos. And what has happened is all the technology investments that supply chain professionals spent money on, whether it's visibility systems, robotic systems, all of the stuff that took place. I mean, one of the things we forgot about that no one's talking about is during the COVID crisis, it wasn't just your dock workers that weren't showing up. It wasn't just your truck drivers. You were losing people who had domain expertise in logistics that or had never been in logistics that were now running your most important freight that were having to learn on the job about how this stuff works. And so that brain drain of people moving between companies and people taking time off was just massive chaos, and we all paid for it in the supply chain. This is a much more orderly set of conditions. Now, I have said this earlier, is if there is a strike on the East Coast, it will have impacts of causing supply chain crisis, because what will happen is most of these things can be planned for, but there's always something that you forgot to do, and it's that one component that runs your entire supply chain that you forgot was in that one box sitting from that shipment from Bangalore that you forgot to do, or coming from South Africa and you're like,
Unforeseen things.
I can't even produce what I got to produce because the copper that I ordered is in this box sitting here on this ship that I knew nothing about.
Right.
And so those are the types of things that cause disruptions, is the unanticipated events. And so it is certainly most of the products. A lot of shippers are rerouting to other ports, and so we do have some element. It's the unexpected stuff that actually catches you by surprise. And if you've been around logistics, a lot of stuff happens. This is an imprecise industry, and people make a lot of mistakes, oftentimes honest mistakes, and oftentimes it's not you. It could be your supplier that loaded up that container in South Africa and said, oh, I thought you wanted it here, because you usually take it in Indonesia. I didn't know you wanted it routed to LA. Like, all this stuff happens, and that's the stuff that catches you off guard, and that's the things that I think can cause problems. So I do believe an ILA strike will have a profound impact on supply chains. We're not seeing any of that right now.
Yeah, I mean, well, they've ordered stuff in front of all the things that we talked about. A little bit of pull forward there. I was talking to Mike Bowdendistel, and he put out a thing that said, okay, what does a one-day strike mean? Well, one-day strike means that you have probably a few days of disruption for the supply. 1 week strike. Now you're talking about into mid-November of disruption.
It's bottlenecking, right? Like, because remember,
it compounds.
Remember, it's almost like, I think about like denial of service. You know how denial of service attack happens, like a network? For those that aren't supply chain folks, will appreciate this. Is like, denial of service is effectively someone flooding your systems with a bunch of traffic, and the system is constantly trying to read that traffic, but more is coming in. The problem is the stuff that you're trying to process is also being backed up, and all of a sudden your system's crashed because it doesn't know what to do. It has too much volume of traffic coming in, caused by a small bottleneck, and that's effectively what a denial of service attack works like. It's just so much volume. Same thing happens here. We have a small disruption. The system can heal.
Right.
As you go longer and more freight is coming in, I still have to deal with the freight that I haven't touched.
Right.
And so we have this, and there's only a finite number of crews. And it depends on how motivated those crews are, frankly. If they're in a contested strike or a contested labor issue, even if the strike is resolved, but it's not resolved in a way that they're satisfied with. And I'm not saying they're not honest actors, but like, if I was expecting a 10% increase in salary and maybe something else, and I got a much lower number, then I might not work as hard as I otherwise would have. Now, and so those things will cause impacts, and that bottlenecking will start to play out. So it isn't a matter of 1 day equals 1 day out. It could be a week equals a month out. Right. And that's what causes the problem. It's the same thing that happened with all those ships off the west coast of LA, off Long Beach, we took photos of. It was a bottlenecking problem.
Well, it took months.
It did.
Even when they stopped ordering.
It took months to clear. And the problem with supply chains is, and this is what happened during COVID, is we shut down the global economy was shut down, global production was shut down, global economy was shut down. Demand did not stop. In fact, demand went insane because the governments of the world flooded the economies full of money, and it caused a lot of demand. And it took 2 years. And arguably, in many parts of the freight market, we're still paying the price of a lot of those sends. Yeah. Like, maybe we're not having the high demand that we had 2 years ago or 4 years ago, but we are certainly paying the higher cost capital. In freight specifically, the amount of excess capacity we added. Like, there's a lot of changes. Mostly, like, I don't know, I'm gonna ask you a question, Zach. Has your life, if you sort of think about your life today versus 5 years ago, does it feel that different?
I mean, when I think about it, it's dramatically different, but it's not in the sense of my mentality. I mean, you're talking about pre-COVID.
Pre-COVID versus today.
So the remote world was...
Work maybe an area, remote. Yeah. But in terms of, I mean, your kids are older. Yeah. I have new kids that showed up during COVID. Right. I know how they got there, but they showed up. Functionally, my life, other than my work life, hasn't changed a whole lot, right? Like, I've done new things that I could have easily done pre-COVID. Right. But like I'm saying, is like, I go out to eat, don't think about any of the COVID period. I mean, we get grocery delivery, which is a new concept for me in a COVID world, but like we're going to kids' activities, we're going to the soccer games. Like we're doing the stuff that we wore pre-COVID. My life as an economy, as a population, life is not that different. And yet we have all of the stuff that's still so different than it was before.
I will say this, I think one of the things that COVID has done to us psychologically, it is kind of inoculated us to volatility to an extent. Now we're more tolerant of some of these swings, which inevitably creates more swings. Like
it's that whole bull effect.
We're in almost like, if you mentioned to start the webinar here, the show, that when was normal? When was the last normal? I would argue that we haven't had a normal, which I would define as a level of consistency or a sustainable environment, since 2014, 15.
Well, but remember the 14, 15, we had that was the day, those are the days that in 2014, we had record high oil prices.
Yeah.
We had the collapse of the industrial economy. Oil went from $140 a barrel to $26 a barrel, which was a low at the time.
Right.
And it rallied up from $26 a barrel in early 2016. And that was the formational days of FreightWaves. Is like the idea that it was volatile. I remember Paul Page, the Wall Street Journal editor, back in 2016 made this comment that freight wasn't volatile, like trucking's not volatile. Like he was contesting the idea that there was volatility in trucking. And he's like, well, it's not volatile. And I'm like, what are you talking about? It's not volatile. Because a lot of from 2010 to 2014, it was a pretty, but that was an unusual period in time.
Right.
Like go back, Zach, you and I've known each other for a long time. I know you before you were a freight guy. And when you first joined US Express back in 2002.
It was 4.
Oh, you were late.
Yeah, that's late.
Oh, you were like.
Katrina was already starting to hit.
Okay, so 2004.
Yeah.
But if we go back to, we had September, I thought you were joined us before, but let's think about this. We had September 11, caused a lot of volatility in the market in 2002. We had the hurricanes in 2003 and 2004 and 2005. It was like a big hurricane season. Then we had a freight recession in 2006. I remember this because I was reading all the Yellow articles as I was doing research, and I was like, there was a freight recession in 2006. We were coming out of it. If you go back and read the articles in 2008, they were talking about a recovery in the freight market in January of 2008 out of this really dark recession.
Right.
Well, then Lehman Brothers not so fast. And so when Lehman and Bear Stearns collapsed, you saw a significant downturn in the economy. We didn't get out of that recessionary period. So we were in 2007 to really 2012 before the end of 11, before the freight market really, really recovered. And the reason I say that is this industry is always volatile. But one of the things I think is happening is the information that's happening in the market has never been more transparent. We are both a contributor of that and a beneficiary of that. Not everyone's benefiting from that, by the way. As an old school trucker, volatility is an enemy. So we are certainly creating more awareness of what's happening, but this is inevitable.
Right.
It's Facebook boards of drivers talking about the market. It is all the tools and services. It's the load board activity. It's the stuff that DAT and Truck Stop post. It's everybody is bringing awareness to freight, and it's never been talked like before.
Right.
And I think that's what was missing in 2016 when I had the conversation with Paul Page. He didn't see it because nobody was talking about freight rates. And freight brokers play such an important role in the market today that they didn't in that period from before. And the volatility is happening. Volatility is here to stay.
Right.
It is going to be something that you have to become a friend with because there's more awareness, more transparency. The bid-ask spread is going to narrow.
Right.
The difference between parties, because now, in the early parts of a market when they become more transparent, bid-ask spread actually stretches because there's parties that have the data and the parties that don't.
Yeah.
And then eventually, and this happens, I was studying markets when we were thinking about FreightWaves, every market works this way. As the market becomes more transparent, your bid-ask spread actually narrows, but the direction, the decisions inside that bid-ask spread is quite volatile.
Crazy.
One of the things that I think is really interesting is I read this article years ago about Amazon's buying network and all these merchants. And it's the same thing there. New category, there's no price transparency, but all of a sudden the algorithm takes over and all of a sudden new merchants appear in the network. The more participants, the bid-ask spread expands, and then it compresses, the volatility actually increases because they're always trying to one up another. And that's what's happening is this volatility is driven by these extraneous events like capital spending, market expansion. But what we also need to talk about is the level of transparency and awareness about the cycles that are driving a lot of these developments. I mean, if you go back to 2021, and even in 2000, everybody in the second half of 2020, everybody in the news and the media was talking about the lack of truck drivers.
Right.
Lack of products is called by the lack of truck drivers, the driver shortage. And then it was the supply chain crisis and all the ocean ships. Supply chain became cool, and everyone thought they could make a fortune and become a billionaire by being a trucking company.
Yeah.
I've told this story before, but I was building a house, and the guy that's building my retaining wall came out to me, and he knew I was involved in freight, and he's like, a friend of his was an insurance sales guy, and he said he bought some trucks. I was like, well, how many did you buy? He bought 100 trucks. I was like, oh, that's a big bet. And he's like, he's making money hand over fist. And I was like, does he know anything about the trucking industry? He goes, no. I said, wait for 2 years, because this is a business that is so brutal. And I think what's happening is the awareness of these issues has never been more transparent. The level of interest in what's happening has never been more relevant. But we're going to see volatility that's here to stay because information is now flowing. This is an example of it, where people are tuning in, watching you and I talk about charts for an hour and BS about every topic that drives freight.
Right.
There is an audience for this because people care about the volatility. It will only increase as the market becomes more volatile.
Yeah, I want to end on one thing because we didn't mention spot rates. I want to end on this last chart here before we take some Q&A. But the National Truckload Index, line haul only, and I've got the OTRI underneath it, NTIL versus OTRI, so spot rates, they're going up. And this is the white line, not that one, there you go, that one. The white line is going to be the spot rate, and the yellow line is going to be tender rejections. Now, tender rejections, of course, correlate very highly with spot rates. It's the point of this, but both of them, over the last year, we just talked about how it's a soft freight market. Yes, but over the last year, rates and rejections, they are trending higher.
That's the part that everyone's like, hasn't been a recovery. You said it's a recovery. Yes, but like, what does that mean?
Yeah.
Is this a good rate or is this a bad rate? It's irrelevant. Like at the end of the day, people ask you and all the time as me, what is a good tender rejection rate? And I always say, my answer is a rate, a number that's higher than yesterday's.
Yeah.
And in other words, like the actual number itself does not matter as much as the direction of the market.
Right.
And so what I tend to look at is, are things getting better? Are we seeing better conditions in year-over-year comps? And if the answer is yes, then there's reasons to feel like it's bullish. Is the chart trending up? Hasn't looked very good since July, but we've seen it bottom, it looks like.
It's going up and down.
It's kind of levels in September. I think there's reasons to be optimistic. There's a lot of negativity out there. Politicians are piling it on. Everybody's stressed out about what the direction of the election is going to be. And what we really need is some positivity.
Yeah, and I mean, the direction of the market is leaning towards tighter. It may be almost unnoticeable to the world.
It probably is because everyone's sort of experiencing it. And the one thing to keep in mind is capacity is still leaving the market. Short of a big economic stimulus just doesn't appear to be happening. However, I mean, cutting monetary policy, Fed cutting 50 basis points, at some point will show up in the economy. If nothing else, it will release a lot of pent-up decisions and capital spending. It'll take long. It takes 8 months to a year.
8 to 15 months.
Yeah. So like, it's not an immediate thing. I think psychology matters because people have held off on spending.
But that's the exact thing. Is people have been thinking a rate cut all year long.
Yeah, and they're waiting.
They're waiting.
So it's interesting. I have an aircraft finance business. I own. I think I've talked about this a little bit. We went for a period where we get about 150 leads a month, and over the weekend, these are aircraft finance. They're typically pilot-flown aircraft, not jets. These are small, light piston aircraft. Got 140 leads this weekend in 3 days. Now, we did some things internally, But more importantly, I think there was so much pent-up demand. Everybody's like, the Fed's going to cut. It's here, baby.
Yeah,
Let's
they're
go. And I think some of those purchases that people put off because they knew they're going to finance them, they held off, and they're waiting for rates to come down. So that matters.
Exactly. Well, let's go ahead and kick it over to Julia for a Q&A session because I want to make sure we get a few of those at least.
Awesome. Yeah, we've got a bunch of great questions that have already come in. If you haven't sent in your questions, you've got plenty of time. Enter those in the Q&A box, and I'll go through as many as we can. This first question has been asked by quite a lot of people. Do you think the ILA strike will cause front loading in the East Coast ports in September? Do you think goods will continue to shift to the West Coast or somewhere else?
I think those decisions have probably already been made. Like,
Yeah, absolutely.
I think, and you saw, there was a report, 2 days ago, I think, where the ocean container lines are now starting to charge surcharges if it's East Coast bound because they don't know if these containers are going to sit out there.
Right.
Like, the container lines have gotten their pricing act together, sort of like the airlines have figured that out for consumers. They're certainly, if they can pass on a fuel surcharge, a surcharge of any kind, they'll do it. But there's also some reality that, but if those decisions haven't been made by now, you're probably behind the times.
Yeah, I mean, we looked at, we didn't look at this chart here, the Los Angeles outbound tender volume chart, where demand out of the West Coast has already been surging. Year-over-year growth is astronomical in terms of total tenders. It hasn't necessarily manifested in a tighter market in September. It did in June, while intermodal was kind of getting ramped up and some of those empties were getting pulled back, but it's already occurred. And I think...
Well, I think it could be occurring.
Yeah.
Like,
yeah,
as there isn't a
occurring.
resolution, and if you don't have stuff that's not super expedited, maybe you have, you're importing some winter coats or something.
Yeah.
And you have plenty of lead time in your cycle.
Yeah.
You probably are starting to route separately. Like, I'm moving freight into Savannah, I'm moving to Houston, I'm moving to New Orleans.
We're 11 days out.
Yeah.
So the
I
time
think
it takes.
a lot of those decisions, and I certainly think they're happening, but I think a lot of the decisions, if I have something that has to be in for the holidays, and if I was going to react to the strike, I probably would have made those decisions earlier.
Yeah.
But it's what we said. People wait to the last minute. They make mistakes, and I'm sure that some of our viewers had people, not them,
100%.
someone there on their team that made a mistake.
Absolutely.
Or not on their team, on their supplier's team.
Right. Not your fault.
This next question also relates to the strike. What downstream effects would an East Coast port strike have on air freight?
Oh, this is a great question because this is a good one. This is demonstrative. It's going to create really high prices for spot prices for air freight. A couple reasons. One is it's going to be the example of people are looking for lift and capacity and get things in. But also it goes back to the example we gave earlier, is you're going to find out that someone else made a mistake and shipped your copper or shipped some product in the container that's stuck at the port, and you're like, I don't care what it costs. I'm not prepared to shut my assembly line down, so get it airlifted. And the thing is, like, it doesn't, like, the amount of volume that moves through air freight versus the amount of volume on a single container ship is, like, the delta between those two is so, like, container ships, a single ship has as much airlift capacity as the entire air freight in a single day. Like, we're talking about, dozens and hundreds of ships potentially being not able to port with lots of containers. That's a big problem, whereas there's a finite amount of air freight capacity. So I think air freight prices, spot prices will certainly go up. I think it's going to be the exceptions of, I forgot I had this problem, or I need to prepare for this shutdown, or I need that product. I don't know when it's going to clear, that's going to matter.
Also, conditions change. Information changes. And
Absolutely.
now you know that you need a thing that you didn't know you needed a month ago.
That's the the supply chain, the JIT auto supply chain is built around those decisions.
Next question here. Can you elaborate on the relationship between large trucking volume and still having low warehouse demand? How do you think this will change by the end of the year?
Well, we haven't seen large trucking volume yet. I mean, we've seen volume that's steady, and year over year it's better. Tender projections say there's too much capacity in the system. Warehouse demand isn't what I'm referring to when I talked about Prologis example. It's more of new projects. Maybe it's the same thing, new project demand. There isn't from what I understand about the real estate market, it's not as if we're seeing demand for companies cancel their warehouse lease. We saw that during COVID with Amazon and others. But it's a matter of new projects, of new big projects are just not happening because the companies that are driving the import market and the companies that will be driving a lot of the volume in trucking in the holiday season have logistics networks.
Yep.
They don't need new warehouse space. Now, we do see, and I think the tariffs, and we've talked a little bit about the election, but this whole new tariff regime that if Donald Trump were to win, is going to create a lot of opportunity, particularly along the Mexico-US border and inland for warehouse space. It may take months and years, but the reason that that's going to be important is most people think of ocean freight as the port or the crane and the terminal and the port. I mean, all this stuff is as its own. What a port is not just a functional geolocation, but it is a epicenter, a centroid, if you will, of all of this other logistics activity. It's the distribution centers, it's the dray drivers, it's the intermodal yards, it's all the stuff that makes a port work. And I think what we'll see is as people look at manufacturing moving to other parts and potentially sourcing or putting products in warehouses here, we're going to see new expansion of warehouse. So I would say that on the real estate function, a change in tariffs is bullish for warehouse space because people will hold on to products longer versus negative.
Yeah, and I think that's more of an upstream. Like right now, we're seeing a lot of that upstream activity versus the downstream activity as well, which is also keeping that somewhat divergent.
Awesome. Next question here. Does the increased IOTI index translate to higher over-the-road freight rates?
That's a great question. We've talked a little bit about it, is IOTI, the correlation between IOTI and truckload is got to be measured in months, not days. And I think a lot of folks, we do it here as well, want them to be tighter correlated because it's so much cooler when you can see something that impactful. But in terms of looking at it, you got to shape shift it by about, at least 3 months, if not, quarter,
Yeah,
2 quarters.
and not all of this gets on a truck.
A lot of it, as you said, is going intermodal rail.
Yeah, I mean, rail is really being a pretty strong release valve for pressure on truckload capacity right now, which is a little counterproductive to intermodal, honestly, because it keeps their rates from increasing to an extent because they're an additional capacity player. But also this is, from China to Los Angeles, that's 15 days for that hits. And to your point.
Yeah, this is based on bookings.
This
is bookings data, not based on what's clearing customs.
Yeah.
And 15 days, then you got the whole idea that it's got to go. I mean, most of the stuff is broken in some type of a sort facility of some sort, distribution center, warehouse, depends on how you describe it, and cross dock. And so what they'll do is they'll break the trailer or container, and they'll sort it, and it may sit there for a month or 3 months.
And I think also you have to keep, I think a lot of times, and I run into this myself, is we talk about demand as the only way to understand supply and demand's relationship. Like most of the time, yes, it's easy to understand the market and pure relationship of demand. The one component that we really can't see very well outside of it leaving is capacity.
Yeah,
and
that's why we see it through tender rejection data.
Yeah,
we get
see the end result
on what's happening in rejection data. But in terms of actually seeing it physically, we've talked about this, the number of operating authorities and counting the number of trucks. That data is so lagged. It's valuable because it's directional signals and proxies, but it's hard to scientifically draw conclusions. You shouldn't because of the significant lag. Whereas things like tender rejection data is really important. It's interesting because at the end of the day, capacity is sort of like cosmic radiation. In other words, it's there.
Yeah.
It's happening. It's in the background.
Dark matter.
It's all happening. You just can't see it.
Right.
But it's there.
Yeah.
And I think a lot of this is the same thing. Is we know capacity is a consideration. Well, we can't track it in real time. Volume is much easier to track. Capacity is not.
Right.
I have to use these other signals to get to it, and that is the tender rejection data to figure it out. That is the reason it's so important. But it is it's static.
Yeah.
That's what static is on the radio. It's background radiation.
Noise.
It's here. It exists. You just can't see it.
Yeah.
Awesome. We've had so many great questions come through. I've got time for just one more. Is the LTL market beginning to soften?
Wow, that's a good one. Volume, like you're closer to the LTL data than I am, but the issue in LTL is there's less capacity than there was a year. These guys are incredibly rational about capacity.
Yeah.
What do you see in LTL?
Yeah, the barriers to entry in LTL are much greater. You don't just buy a truck and you have an LTL operation. You have LTL networks are nodes, they're spokes and hubs, so you have to almost enter an area with a group of trucks before you. So that's one reason why that market's much more disciplined than the truckload market. But what we're seeing in a lot of our data right now is a normalization of rate flow. So the pricing pressures from Yellow's exit have largely dissipated. So not to say that the market is collapsing in LTL, but we're starting to see a lot flatter to slightly down rate signals entering the as we exit the third quarter. And this is due to some of the back end data that we have access to here. I'm not just talking in terms of general understanding, but yeah, the data is suggesting that we did see a bit of a bubble. That's why we saw better year over year Q2, Q3 earnings for a lot of these LTL providers. They had a nice comp due to Yellow's exit. And now we're starting to see that fade out. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean they're going to have a tough third and fourth quarter necessarily, because rates are just not increasing dramatically anymore.
Yeah, and labor isn't as big of a challenge as it was 2 years ago.
Right.
Labor availability, particularly for LTL operators, truckload operators, truckload drivers are leaving perhaps the over-the-road market, going to LTL. Labor pressures exist, but not nearly what they were a couple of years ago. And so that is certainly keeping their sort of inflationary inputs out and will make, so their earnings are perhaps more predictable.
Yeah, a little bit flatter on the volume.
Awesome. Thank you, guys. Well, it does look like that is all of the time that we have for today. Craig and Zach, as always, thanks for joining us and sharing your insights with us. Of course, thank you, our audience, for asking so many great questions and really participating in this event and making it what it is. Before I sign off, I do want to share a quick reminder that our F3 Future of Freight Festival kicks off in just 2 months. It's going to be right here in Chattanooga, Tennessee, November 19th through the 21st. So mark your calendars. If you haven't been to a FreightWaves event, it's gonna rock your world. Go to live.freightwaves.com to get your tickets. And our State of Freight webinar series does continue again on October 17th. Keep your eyes out for that invite. Thanks everyone for joining us, and see you next month.